A virus doesn't care about morality. It doesn't distinguish between the innocent and the guilty, between those who deserve suffering and those who stumble into it by accident. A virus simply replicates, consuming whatever living tissue it encounters, transforming cells according to its genetic programming. The Resident Evil timeline spans over a century, but at its core it asks one question that never gets fully answered. What happens when human ambition becomes the virus? Over the next several hours, we're going to trace the complete Resident Evil story leading up to Requiem. From a grieving mother in an Eastern European cave to the destruction of Raccoon City, from bioweapons designed in underground laboratories to the family lineages that carry infection across generations. By the end, you'll understand how corporate greed, unchecked scientific ambition, and personal trauma created a world where survival horror became survival reality. This video analyzes and interprets the Resident Evil narrative through examination of its themes, character motivations, and institutional critique rather than simply recapping plot events. This video should get everyone caught up to what's happened so far before Requiem is released. If something in this deep dive resonates with you, drop a comment letting me know what connected, whether it was a specific character, a moment that made you see the series differently, or just a detail you'd never noticed before. And throw out a topic suggestion for a future video while you're there. So now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1. The Mother, the Mold, and the Origin. Miranda didn't start as a villain. She started as a mother burying her daughter. The Spanish flu pandemic swept across Europe between 1918 and 1920, killing tens of millions. Among those victims was a young girl named Eva, daughter to a woman who had dedicated her life to biological research. The year was 1919 when the flu took her daughter, leaving Miranda, a trained scientist, someone who understood cellular structures and viral mechanisms, utterly powerless against microscopic organisms she couldn't see or stop. Grief of this magnitude doesn't follow predictable patterns. Some people retreat into numbness, creating emotional distance that makes functioning possible. Others redirect their pain into productive channels, building something meaningful from their loss. Miranda chose a third path. She walked into a cave intending to end her existence, carrying the kind of despair that makes death feel like relief rather than tragedy. What she found in that cave would reshape the entire Resident Evil timeline. The mold existed long before Miranda discovered it. This fungal supercolony had been growing in that cave system for centuries, possibly millennia, consuming organic matter that wandered into its domain. Fungi operate differently than other life forms. They don't just consume, they integrate. The mold had absorbed countless organisms over its existence, and in doing so, it had preserved something of their consciousness, their memories, their sense of self, all held within its sprawling mycelial network, like information stored in biological hard drives. When Miranda made contact with the mold, touching the massive growth in what should have been her final moments, she experienced something that fundamentally altered her understanding of what life and death actually meant. The mold showed her memories, hundreds or thousands of consciousnesses it had assimilated. Among them, impossibly, was Eva. Her daughter's body had been buried near enough to the cave system that the mold had reached it, consumed it, and in the process of breaking down that small corpse, it had somehow preserved fragments of who Eva had been. This discovery rewired Miranda's grief into obsession. If the mold had preserved Eva's consciousness, perhaps it could restore her. Perhaps with the right vessel, the right biological conditions, the right application of the mold's regenerative properties, Miranda could bring her daughter back. This wasn't resurrection in any supernatural sense. This was a scientist recognizing a biological mechanism that might accomplish what religious faith promised, but never delivered. Miranda returned from the cave transformed. The mold had infected her during that initial contact, granting her vastly extended lifespan and abilities that seemed supernatural but were actually expressions of the fungus's capacity to manipulate living tissue. She could control the mold, shape it, use it to alter other organisms, and she immediately began using those abilities on the isolated mountain village she called home. The villagers were suffering from illness, likely the same pandemic that had taken Eva. Miranda used the mold to cure them, and the results appeared miraculous. People on the edge of death suddenly recovered. The fungal infection granted them resistance to disease. From the villagers' perspective, this was divine intervention. Miranda encouraged that interpretation. She began preaching about something she called the Black God, presenting the mold as a deity worthy of worship rather than a fungal organism with unusual properties. Within a short period, Miranda had established herself as Mother Miranda, prophet of the Black God, spiritual leader of a village that had abandoned Christianity in favor of her new cult. This transformation reveals something crucial about Miranda's psychology. She wasn't delusional. She knew exactly what the mold was, but she understood that religious framing gave her social control, that villagers who viewed her as a prophet would submit to experimentation they'd resist if presented honestly. For the next century, Miranda conducted experiments on the village population. She created something called the Kadu, a parasitic organism derived from the mold that could be implanted into hosts, causing dramatic mutations. Most subjects died or transformed into creatures called lichens, humans whose bodies had been reshaped by the parasite into wolf-like monsters that retained minimal human cognition. These weren't successful experiments from Miranda's perspective. She wasn't trying to create weapons. She was searching for someone whose biology would accept the mold completely, whose body could serve as a vessel for consciousness. 4 individuals successfully bonded with the Kadu without losing their minds entirely. These became the 4 lords who ruled different territories around the village under Miranda's authority. Alcina Dimitrescu, ruler of Castle Dimitrescu. Donna Beneviento, mistress of House Beneviento. Salvatore Moreau, who inhabited the reservoir. And Karl Heisenberg, lord of the factory. Each represented a different type of successful mutation, but none possessed the specific qualities Miranda needed for Eva's resurrection. The experiments continued. Decades passed. Miranda remained ageless, while generations of villagers lived and died, their bodies used as test subjects for a woman trying to undo a loss that had happened before most of their grandparents were born. This creates the first crucial insight about Resident Evil's institutional horror. Miranda represents grief that refuses to accept death's finality, transformed into scientific methodology without ethical constraints. She's conducting systematic atrocity while genuinely believing she's working toward something meaningful, the return of her daughter. From her perspective, the lichens, the failed experiments, the centuries of suffering she's inflicted on the village are all acceptable costs for a goal she views as justifying any means. This pattern, personal trauma weaponized into institutional horror, will repeat throughout the Resident Evil timeline. Remember it, because the man who founded Umbrella Corporation learned his foundational lesson about bioorganic weapons from watching Miranda work. His name was Oswell E. Spencer, and their meeting would transform Miranda's isolated experiments into a global catastrophe. Chapter 2. When Ambition Met Obsession. Oswell E. Spencer was born into British aristocracy, carrying the kind of privilege that makes people believe the world exists to serve their vision. He was intelligent, educated, and possessed the particular arrogance that comes from never experiencing meaningful consequences for your actions. In the early 1950s, Spencer was backpacking through Eastern Europe, engaging in the kind of adventure travel that wealthy young men undertook to prove themselves before settling into family estates and inherited responsibilities. He got lost. Inexperience with wilderness navigation combined with harsh winter conditions left him collapsed on a snow-covered road in a remote region, likely dying from exposure. Miranda found him there and brought him back to her village, offering the hospitality that isolated communities traditionally extended to travelers in distress. Spencer recovered in the village over a period of weeks, and during that time, he observed something that would define the rest of his life and doom countless others. He saw villagers worshiping the Black God. He witnessed Miranda's authority over people who treated her with reverence bordering on religious ecstasy. And eventually, Miranda told him about the mold, its regenerative properties, its ability to mutate and assimilate living organisms, its potential for creating enhanced humans. Miranda wanted to resurrect her daughter. Spencer had far more ambitious plans. He understood immediately that what Miranda had discovered represented power on a scale most people couldn't comprehend, the ability to alter human biology deliberately, to create beings with strength beyond normal limits, to manipulate life itself. This was the key to remaking human society. Spencer had developed a deeply misanthropic worldview. He viewed humanity's current state as a mistake that needed correction, and he believed people like himself, intellectually superior, morally unencumbered by conventional ethics, should be the ones deciding what the corrected version looked like. Before leaving the village, Spencer studied the symbol representing the four lords, the families who ruled the region's territories. The symbol was a cross-like design incorporating imagery from each house. Spencer took that symbol with him when he left, and it would become the foundation for one of the most recognized logos in gaming history. The red and white umbrella that would mark every product, facility, and bioweapon created by the corporation he was already planning. Spencer returned to his life in the West, but now with singular focus. He needed to recreate what Miranda had accomplished, but on industrial scale. He needed researchers, funding, facilities, and most importantly, he needed a viral agent they could control and modify. Miranda's mold was one possibility, but Spencer recognized the limitations of working with a fungal organism that required specific environmental conditions. He needed something more portable, more weaponizable. He reached out to two individuals who would become his co-founders in this venture. James Marcus was a university colleague, a virologist with brilliant insights and complete absence of ethical boundaries when it came to research. Edward Ashford was the son of a wealthy aristocratic family willing to fund ambitious scientific projects that conventional institutions wouldn't touch. In the mid-1960s, the three men mounted an expedition to West Africa, searching for something they'd heard rumors about, a flower locals called the Stairway to the Sun. The flower was said to have remarkable properties, growing in locations where no other vegetation survived. When they finally located specimens and brought them back to laboratories, analysis revealed something extraordinary. The flower contained a virus unlike anything previously documented. This viral agent could genetically alter organisms at a fundamental level, rewriting cellular structures according to patterns the researchers were only beginning to understand. They named it the progenitor virus, and it became the foundation for everything that followed. In 1968, Spencer, Marcus, and Ashford formally established the Umbrella Corporation, the public-facing operation presented as a pharmaceutical company dedicated to advancing human health through innovative research. The private reality was a weapons development program exploring how the progenitor virus could create what they termed bioorganic weapons, living organisms engineered for military application. Spencer commissioned construction of a mansion in the Arklay Mountains, outside a small Midwestern city called Raccoon City. The mansion itself was elaborate, designed by an architect named George Trevor, who Spencer would later murder to protect secrets about hidden passages and underground facilities. Beneath the mansion, construction crews built massive research laboratories where viral research could be conducted away from regulatory oversight or public awareness. The progenitor virus showed promise, but it had limitations. Most organisms exposed to it simply died. The few that survived often mutated unpredictably, becoming dangerous but not controllable. The researchers needed something more refined, a modified version of the progenitor that could reliably produce specific results. James Marcus took the lead on this project. He combined the progenitor virus with DNA from leeches, creating a modified strain they designated the T virus, T standing for tyrant, the code name for the super soldier program Spencer envisioned. The T virus had dramatic effects on living tissue. It caused massive cellular mutation, increased aggression, and in most cases, severe cognitive degradation. Subjects infected with the T virus became what survivors would later call zombies, shambling, violent creatures that attacked living humans with single-minded ferocity while displaying minimal higher brain function. This should have been considered a failure. A virus that turned humans into mindless attack animals wasn't creating super soldiers. But Spencer and his researchers recognized military applications anyway. A virus that could be deployed in enemy territory, turning civilian populations into weapons that attacked their own infrastructure? That had strategic value. The research continued. Testing required subjects. Spencer couldn't use conventional human trials. Ethics boards would never approve research with this level of lethality. Instead, Umbrella established a network of foster homes and orphanages. These facilities ostensibly provided care for children who had nowhere else to go. In reality, they were recruitment centers supplying test subjects for viral experimentation. Children from these facilities were exposed to various viral strains, with researchers documenting results. The mortality rate was catastrophic. Most children died within days or weeks of exposure, their bodies unable to adapt to the genetic restructuring the viruses caused. A tiny fraction survived, showing signs of compatibility that suggested their unique genetic makeup made them resistant or partially immune. One of those survivors was a boy named Albert Wesker. Wesker would become one of the most significant figures in the entire Resident Evil timeline. But in the 1970s, he was simply a subject of Project W, a eugenics program designed by Spencer to cultivate a superior race through indoctrination and training. Umbrella researchers noted his compatibility, tracked his development, and eventually recruited him into the organization as a researcher. Once he reached adulthood, Wesker was intelligent, ambitious, and had internalized the social Darwinist ideology that Spencer promoted. The belief that superior individuals had the right to reshape humanity according to their vision. Wesker formed a working relationship with another young genius in Umbrella's research division, William Birkin, a prodigy whose understanding of viral mechanics made him invaluable despite his youth. The two became Spencer's right-hand men, trusted with increasingly sensitive projects as they proved their loyalty and competence. But the original founders were experiencing tensions. Edward Ashford, the money behind the operation, had concerns about the direction research was taking. He believed the focus should be on controlled enhancement rather than weaponization. In 1968, Edward died after contracting the progenitor virus, an accident that conveniently left Spencer in control. His son, Alexander Ashford, would later retreat to Antarctica to construct a facility for his own Code Veronica project. He would successfully create two clones, Alfred and Alexia Ashford. But that story branches into territory we'll return to later. James Marcus, meanwhile, had become obsessed with leeches. he began experimenting with creating a queen leech, a massive organism that could potentially control swarms of smaller leeches through something resembling a hive mind. Marcus believed the queen leech represented the next evolution in bioorganic weapon development. Spencer disagreed. More accurately, Spencer recognized that Marcus had become a liability, too focused on his pet project, too independent in his thinking, too likely to challenge Spencer's authority over Umbrella's direction. In 1988, Spencer ordered Wesker and Birkin to assassinate Marcus. They carried out the order, shooting their former mentor and disposing of his body in the facility's water treatment system. What they didn't realize was that Marcus's Queen Leech was already operational, already connected to its creator in ways they hadn't anticipated. The Queen Leech found Marcus's corpse and began feeding on it, and in the process of consuming his tissues, something unprecedented occurred. The leech absorbed Marcus's consciousness, creating a hybrid organism that retained Marcus's intelligence and memories but existed in an inhuman form. This hybrid would eventually take revenge, but that confrontation was still a decade away. By the early 1990s, Oswell E. Spencer stood as the sole surviving founder of Umbrella Corporation. He had murdered Ashford, ordered Marcus's assassination, and positioned himself as absolute authority over an organization that now operated in multiple countries, employed thousands of people, and generated enormous profits through pharmaceutical products that disguised its true mission, weaponizing life itself for military application. Umbrella expanded into Raccoon City directly, building underground laboratories beneath the city streets, bribing local officials to ignore questions about construction projects and suspicious shipments. The police chief, Brian Irons, became a particular asset, willing to overlook anything for the right price and occasional access to Umbrella's bioweapon research for his own sadistic purposes. In 1996, Umbrella established a specialized police unit within the Raccoon City Police Department. They called it the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, STARS for short. The unit was ostensibly created to handle high-risk situations that normal police couldn't manage. The actual purpose was to create a test group, elite officers who could eventually be exposed to bioorganic weapons under controlled conditions, providing data on how trained combatants responded to various bioweapon types. Umbrella placed Albert Wesker as captain of STAR's Alpha Team. From this position, Wesker could monitor the unit and, when the time came, orchestrate the field test that would provide Umbrella with invaluable combat data. That field test was coming, because in the Arklay Mountains, containment was already failing. The T-virus doesn't stay in laboratory vials when you're working with living subjects. It finds ways into ventilation systems, gets carried on clothing and equipment, infects animals that find their way into facility spaces. By 1998, the Mansion Laboratory had experienced a containment breach. Infected creatures were escaping into the surrounding forest. Hikers in the Arklay region began reporting attacks by dogs that moved with disturbing aggression and showed signs of severe mutation. Some of those hikers didn't make it home to report anything. Their partially consumed bodies were found by search parties, creating exactly the kind of public pressure that would force police response. The stage was set. Umbrella had its test subjects. The bioweapons were loose. And in a few months, a helicopter would crash in those mountains, beginning a night that would end with a mansion exploding and secrets that were supposed to stay buried. But before that mansion burned, before Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine discovered what Umbrella had created, there was another story. One that began on a train filled with leeches and revenge. One that answered the question of what happened to James Marcus after Wesker and Birkin thought they'd killed him. We're entering the timeline's active phase now, where backstory becomes playable horror, where decades of unethical research collide with people who just wanted to do their jobs and go home. Keep the context we've built in mind. When you see zombies and bioweapons, remember, they're not random monsters. They're consequences of choices made by specific people, pursuing specific goals. Grief weaponized, ambition unrestrained, and the willingness to treat human life as raw material for experiments that serve visions of perfected worlds that nobody asked for. Chapter 3: When Revenge Came for Its Due. July 23, 1998. A train called the Ecliptic Express travels through the Arklay Mountains carrying what appears to be Umbrella personnel and equipment. But the train has been compromised. Leeches swarm through the cars, and the passengers are experiencing something that looks like T-virus infection, but behaves slightly differently. More coordinated, more purposeful, as though something intelligent is directing their actions. STAR's Bravo team has been dispatched to investigate reports of murders in the Arklay region. Their helicopter experiences sudden mechanical failure, forcing an emergency landing in the mountains. Whether that failure was actually mechanical or deliberately caused by Umbrella sabotage to create the exact scenario Wesker wanted remains unclear, though evidence suggests the latter. The team survives the crash and begins searching the area for the source of the attacks they'd been sent to investigate. Rebecca Chambers, the youngest member of Bravo team, encounters the Ecliptic Express abandoned in the forest. She's a rookie, just 18 years old, trained as a field medic rather than a combat specialist, completely unprepared for what she's about to experience. But she enters the train because that's what her training dictates, investigating potential threats, even when every instinct says to run. Inside the train, Rebecca encounters Billy Cohen. He's a former Marine lieutenant, convicted of murdering 23 people during a mission in Africa, being transported to his execution when the vehicle carrying him crashed near the mountains. Billy escaped, and the official story paints him as extremely dangerous, a mass murderer who killed civilians without provocation or orders. Billy's version of events is different. He claims his commanding officer ordered the massacre of a village as a punitive measure, that Billy refused the order, and that when he attempted to report the war crime, he was framed for it instead. Whether his account is accurate becomes irrelevant when Rebecca and Billy realize they're both trapped on a train filled with zombies and leech swarms, surrounded by threats that make their personal histories feel secondary to immediate survival. The train is a setup, not for Rebecca and Billy specifically, but as a stage for something that's been waiting 10 years to make its entrance. The Marcus Leach hybrid has been growing in the underground research facility, beneath the training center, feeding on the anger and grief of a murdered scientist whose consciousness somehow persists in the nervous system of an invertebrate organism. The leeches that fill the train are extensions of this hybrid consciousness, and their presence on the Ecliptic Express is the opening move in Marcus's revenge against Umbrella. Rebecca and Billy fight their way through the train, discovering that many of the infected weren't Umbrella employees but prisoners being transported for illegal human experimentation. The realization adds moral complexity to their situation. These zombies were victims before they were monsters. People whose only crime was being vulnerable enough that Umbrella could grab them without consequences. The train eventually crashes directly into the Umbrella training facility, a complex built into the mountains where new employees learn the classified aspects of Umbrella's operations. The facility is now overrun with bioorganic weapons, some familiar, zombies, infected dogs, and some experimental creatures that represent research directions the company was exploring but hadn't perfected. In the facility's depths, Rebecca and Billy encounter the Marcus Leach hybrid directly. It appears as James Marcus, looking exactly as he did 10 years ago before Wesker and Birkin murdered him. But the figure shifts, sometimes appearing as a young man, sometimes as the older scientist he'd become before his death, and sometimes revealing its true nature. A mass of leeches holding human shape through sheer force of collective consciousness. Marcus explains his return in rambling speeches that mix scientific observation with desire for vengeance. He claims Umbrella stole his research, murdered him to silence dissent, and built its empire on viral techniques he developed. The accusations are accurate, but Marcus's solution, unleashing bioorganic weapons across the region to destroy Umbrella's operations regardless of civilian casualties, doesn't suggest justice so much as nihilistic revenge. Albert Wesker and William Birkin appear in the facility briefly, observing the chaos Marcus has created. Wesker is here for reconnaissance, gathering information about the outbreak before the larger STARS field test that's planned for the Spencer Mansion. He's surprised to see Marcus alive, or whatever this hybrid creature counts as, but he adapts quickly, recognizing that Marcus's rampage will need to be contained before it draws attention Umbrella can't manage. William Birkin activates the facility's self-destruct sequence. This is Umbrella's standard response to containment failure. Destroy everything, eliminate evidence, and accept the loss of facilities and research as preferable to public exposure. The countdown begins, giving Rebecca and Billy minutes to escape from an underground complex they barely understand, while fighting through creatures that want them dead. They make it out seconds before the explosion tears through the mountainside. Standing in the forest afterward, covered in blood and viscera, Rebecca realizes she can see the Spencer Mansion in the distance. Her team would be heading there, searching for answers about what's happening in these mountains. Billy should come with her, another survivor to help explain the situation. But Billy is officially a condemned murderer. Even if he's innocent of the original charges, nobody will believe his story. Returning to authorities means execution or life imprisonment. Rebecca makes a decision that defines her character more than anything she does later. She tells Billy to run, to take this chance at life when death was supposed to be inevitable. He gives her his dog tags, and she'll later report finding his body near the facility, letting official records show that Billy Cohen died in the explosion. She watches him disappear into the forest. Then Rebecca Chambers heads toward the mansion, where Alpha Team will be arriving soon, where she'll need to survive another night of horror, where she'll discover that everything they just endured was barely the opening act of something far worse. The Ecliptic Express incident answers a question the timeline planted decades earlier. What happened to James Marcus after his death? But it also establishes a pattern that will repeat throughout Resident Evil. Umbrella's response to problems is escalating violence and destruction, burning evidence rather than addressing ethical failures, protecting institutional secrecy at the cost of human lives. And individuals caught in these institutional failures must decide whether to follow official protocol or make choices they can live with. Rebecca chose mercy over procedure. That choice let Billy Cohen live, somewhere in America with a new identity and the fading hope that he can build something normal from the wreckage of his framed conviction. But it also means Rebecca enters the Spencer Mansion already carrying secrets, already having learned that sometimes the right choice violates every rule you're supposed to follow. She's about to learn the same lesson on a much larger scale, because the mansion contains truths that will reshape her understanding of the organization STARS serves, the city that employs them, and the man leading Alpha Team, who has been planning their deaths since the moment they joined his unit. Chapter 4. The Mansion, where everything changed. The Spencer Mansion sits in isolation, architectural excess surrounded by forest. From the outside, it appears to be exactly what wealthy industrialists built during the late 19th century. Too many rooms, too much ornamentation, a monument to someone's need to prove their importance through real estate. But George Trevor, the architect who designed it, built something far more complex than a simple mansion. He incorporated hidden passages, concealed laboratories, and mechanical puzzles that would make navigation nearly impossible for anyone who didn't possess detailed blueprints. Spencer murdered Trevor and his entire family once construction finished, ensuring that knowledge of the mansion's secrets died with them. This wasn't paranoia. This was calculated operational security, eliminating anyone who could testify about what lay beneath the elegant facade. July 24th, 1998. Alpha Team arrives in response to Bravo Team's disappearance. The helicopter carrying Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Albert Wesker, and several other STARS members land in a clearing near the mansion after spotting the wreckage of Bravo Team's helicopter. Before they can investigate properly, infected Cerberus dogs, Dobermans mutated by the T-virus into something that barely resembles canine anatomy anymore, attack from the forest. The team scatters. One member is killed immediately, torn apart by dogs that move with speed and aggression far beyond normal animal behavior. The survivors run for the only visible shelter, the mansion itself, and barricade themselves inside as more dogs circle the building. They're trapped. The radio doesn't work, possibly due to mountains interfering with signals, possibly due to umbrella jamming communications. The mansion appears abandoned but shows signs of recent occupation. And as the team begins exploring, searching for supplies or alternative exits, they discover that abandonment is the wrong word. The mansion is very much occupied. The first zombie Chris, or Jill, encounters is eating what's left of another STARS member from Bravo Team. The zombie turns toward them, face covered in blood, moving with the distinctive shambling gait that every survivor of the outbreak will come to recognize. The team has combat training, but that training assumes human opponents who'd react to gunfire predictably. Zombies don't flinch from minor wounds. They keep advancing until catastrophic damage destroys enough tissue to stop motor function entirely. This is the moment when Resident Evil shifts from procedural investigation to survival horror. The mansion becomes a labyrinth where every door might hide something that wants to kill you, where ammunition becomes precious because you can't waste bullets on threats you might be able to avoid, where the architecture itself functions as an additional antagonist, making navigation deliberately difficult. The STARS members split up to cover more ground, a tactically sound decision that becomes nightmare fuel when you realize it means facing the mansion's horrors individually, rather than with backup. Chris and Jill explore different sections, encountering zombies, infected crows, giant snakes, and creatures that shouldn't exist outside fever dreams, hunters, bioengineered reptilian monsters created by combining human DNA with reptile genetics to produce something that hunts with animal efficiency and human-like problem solving. In the mansion's depths, they find laboratories. Research notes document experiments conducted on live subjects. Journals from researchers describe orders to continue viral testing despite catastrophic mortality rates. One diary entry, written by someone slowly succumbing to T-virus infection, traces the progression from initial exposure to violent loss of higher cognition, ending with barely legible text before devolving into unreadable scrawls. The evidence accumulates into a picture that forces Chris and Jill to confront uncomfortable realities. Umbrella Corporation, the pharmaceutical company that funds STARS, employs the police chief, and presents itself as a civic benefactor, has been conducting illegal bioweapons research beneath this mansion for decades. The creatures attacking them aren't random outbreaks or natural mutations. They're products deliberately created by scientists following research protocols, documenting results, treating horror as data points in experiments aimed at weaponizing life. The revelations get worse when they encounter Rebecca Chambers, who explains what happened on the Ecliptic Express. Then when they find more documents revealing the true scope of Umbrella's operations, facilities in multiple countries, weapons programs involving dozens of different viral strains, plans to market bioorganic weapons to militaries worldwide. Albert Wesker's betrayal comes as a shock to the team but makes perfect sense once you understand his history. He has been working for Umbrella the entire time, placed in STARS specifically to orchestrate this field test. His job was to lead the team into the mansion, expose them to various bioweapons, and document how trained combatants responded to different threats. The fact that most of his team would die wasn't a failure of the plan. It was data showing which weapons were most effective against armed, trained opponents. Wesker leads Chris and Jill into the underground laboratory beneath the mansion, where they encounter the Tyrant, Umbrella's attempt at creating the perfect bioweapon. The Tyrant is humanoid but massive, its body massively muscled from accelerated growth induced by viral modification. It possesses human-level intelligence combined with physical capabilities far exceeding normal humans, capable of following complex orders while being strong enough to tear apart reinforced structures. Spencer's vision was creating super soldiers, humans enhanced to superhuman levels while retaining intelligence and obedience. The Tyrant represents the closest Umbrella has come to achieving that goal, though it still falls short. The creature is too aggressive, too difficult to control, too likely to turn on handlers if provoked. Wesker attempts to demonstrate the Tyrant for his Umbrella superiors, but the demonstration goes catastrophically wrong when the creature impales him with its clawed hand, apparently killing him instantly. The Tyrant then turns on Chris and Jill, forcing them to fight something that can survive dozens of bullets without slowing down. The mansion's self-destruct sequence activates. Whether Wesker triggered it before dying or whether it was an automated response to containment failure remains unclear. Chris and Jill have minutes to reach the surface, fighting through zombies and hunters while navigating a mansion they barely understand. As explosions begin tearing through the structure, they reach the helipad where Brad Vickers, the pilot who fled when the dogs attacked, has finally returned. The survivors board Chris, Jill, Rebecca, Barry Burton, another Alpha Team member who'd been manipulated by Wesker using threats against his family, and the helicopter lifts off seconds before the final explosion consumes the mansion. From the air, they watch the entire structure collapse into the underground laboratory, burying decades of research and hundreds of test subjects in rubble that will eventually be reclaimed by Forrest. The evidence is destroyed, the bioweapons are contained, and the survivors are returning to Raccoon City with a story that nobody in authority will want to believe. This creates a crucial tension that drives the next phase of the timeline. The STARS members have direct evidence of Umbrella's crimes. They witnessed illegal human experimentation, saw facilities conducting bioweapons research in violation of international treaties, and fought creatures that prove Umbrella has achieved capabilities far beyond anything publicly acknowledged. But they're four traumatized survivors making extraordinary claims against a powerful corporation with political connections, legal resources, and the institutional credibility that comes from being recognized as a legitimate pharmaceutical company. When they report what happened to the police department, they're met with skepticism, dismissal, and eventually outright hostility. The police chief, Brian Irons, is on Umbrella's payroll. The mayor receives campaign contributions from Umbrella-affiliated groups. Local media depends on Umbrella advertising revenue. The entire city has been economically captured by the corporation, making honest investigation of Umbrella's activities politically impossible. STARS is disbanded. Chris, Jill, Rebecca, and Barry are dismissed as unreliable witnesses suffering from trauma-induced delusions. The official story becomes that they encountered wild animals in the mountains. That stress and isolation caused them to construct elaborate conspiracy theories explaining what was actually just a tragic accident involving their fellow officers. Chris Redfield refuses to accept this. He leaves Raccoon City to continue investigating Umbrella independently, eventually connecting with other survivors and forming what will become the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, a private organization dedicated to fighting bioweapon proliferation. But that organization doesn't exist yet in 1998. Right now, Chris is just an angry former cop trying to prove something nobody wants to hear. Jill Valentine remains in Raccoon City initially, attempting to gather more evidence, trying to find ways to force institutional accountability. She'll later regret not leaving when she had the chance, because containment failure wasn't limited to the Spencer mansion. The T-virus had already spread into Raccoon City itself, carried by rats that infested the sewer, systems connecting underground umbrella facilities to the broader municipal infrastructure. The rats bit humans, the humans turned, and the infection began spreading through a population that had no idea they were living directly above laboratories where the pathogen had been developed. September 28, 1998. 3 months after the mansion incident, Raccoon City experiences the outbreak that will define the entire Resident Evil timeline, transforming a Midwestern American city into a quarantine zone and eventually a crater. Chapter 5: When Cities Became Graveyards. Jill Valentine wakes to chaos. The outbreak has progressed faster than anyone anticipated, spreading from isolated incidents to citywide catastrophe in less than 72 hours. The streets are filled with zombies, thousands of them, people who were going about normal lives days ago now shambling through downtown, looking for living flesh to consume. Emergency services have collapsed. Police who tried to maintain order are now either dead, infected, or barricaded in the precinct headquarters, waiting for evacuation that isn't coming. The city is burning, literally. Fires started by accidents, violence, and infrastructure failure are spreading unchecked because there's nobody left to fight them. Smoke hangs over Raccoon City like a funeral shroud, thick enough to make breathing difficult, obscuring visibility and creating an atmosphere that feels apocalyptic because it is. Jill tried to warn them. After the mansion incident, she spent months attempting to document what Umbrella had done, gathering evidence, trying to force an investigation. She was ignored, dismissed, threatened with legal action for making defamatory claims against a respected corporation. Now everyone who dismissed her warnings is either dead or dying, and the vindication tastes like ash. She's trying to escape. Chris left weeks ago, heading to Europe to continue investigating Umbrella from outside the city. Barry evacuated his family to Canada once it became clear that Raccoon City was no longer safe. Rebecca transferred to another city after the police department made it clear her continued employment was contingent on never mentioning the mansion again. Jill stayed too long, believing she could still make a difference, and now she's trapped in a city that's become a mass grave. The evacuation routes are blocked. Umbrella has deployed bioorganic weapons deliberately, using the outbreak as an opportunity to field test their products under combat conditions. The creatures stalking the streets aren't just zombies. There are lickers, humans whose T-virus infection progressed to the point where their skin tore away entirely, leaving exposed muscle tissue and massively elongated tongues they use as weapons. There are hunter variants, different subspecies of the reptilian bioweapons that were tested in the mansion. And there's something new, something Umbrella designated the Nemesis T-type. Nemesis is Hunting Stars members specifically. It's a bioweapon programmed with a single objective: eliminate every surviving member of the team that discovered Umbrella's secrets in the Spencer mansion. The creature is massive, heavily muscled, capable of using weapons ranging from rocket launchers to its own tentacle-like appendages. It speaks, or at least produces sounds that approximate human speech, constantly repeating stars in a voice that sounds like vocal cords are tearing with every syllable. Nemesis finds Jill within hours of beginning its hunt. The creature pursues her through burning streets, through buildings filled with zombies, through subway tunnels where she's trying to navigate toward any possible escape route. Every time she thinks she's lost it, every time she manages to barricade a door or put distance between them, Nemesis finds her again. The creature is relentless, intelligent enough to predict where she'll go, and fast enough to cut off escape routes. During the pursuit, Jill encounters Carlos Oliveira. He's part of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, a private military force that Umbrella deployed ostensibly to evacuate civilians and contain the outbreak. Carlos is genuine in wanting to help people, actually trying to rescue survivors and get them to extraction points. What he doesn't fully understand yet is that his employer created the outbreak deliberately, that the evacuation operation is also a data-gathering exercise, that Umbrella is documenting which weapon systems are most effective while pretending to provide humanitarian assistance. Carlos helps Jill fight through sections of the city, providing covering fire and medical supplies. Their partnership is uneasy. Jill knows Carlos works for Umbrella, even if he doesn't grasp the depths of his employer's corruption. But survival requires cooperation, and Carlos proves himself repeatedly by risking his life to protect civilians who have no connection to him. During one encounter with Nemesis, Jill is infected with the T-virus. The infection happens during combat, when Nemesis's tentacles penetrate her body, injecting viral material directly into her bloodstream. She has hours before the infection progresses to the point where it becomes irreversible, where she'll lose cognitive function and become another zombie, shambling through streets she used to patrol as a police officer. Carlos leaves her in a safe room and ventures alone into the most dangerous sections of Raccoon City, searching for a vaccine he knows Umbrella developed. The vaccine exists because Umbrella researchers needed protection while working with the virus, creating an antidote for their own safety without any intention of mass producing it for potential outbreak victims. Carlos finds the vaccine in a hospital that's been overrun with zombies, and Umbrella experiments that were never meant to see deployment. He returns to Jill and administers the vaccine with hours to spare, before infection would have become terminal. She survives, though the experience leaves her physically weakened and psychologically marked by how close she came to losing herself entirely to a virus created in laboratories beneath the city she tried to protect. But before we see the final escape, we need to understand what's happening simultaneously in a different part of Raccoon City. Because while Jill and Carlos are fighting Nemesis, two other people are arriving in the city for their first day or first night, experiencing hell made manifest. Leon S. Kennedy is a police officer reporting for his first day with the Raccoon City Police Department. He overslept, is running late, and arrives to find his new workplace is the epicenter of an outbreak that's turning the entire city into a death trap. Claire Redfield, sister to Chris, has come to Raccoon City looking for her brother after months of not hearing from him. She arrives the same night as Leon, driving into a city that's already burning. They encounter each other at a gas station on the outskirts, surrounded by zombies, and decide that surviving together makes more sense than dying separately. They drive toward the police station hoping to find answers, safety, or at minimum, an arsenal to help them fight their way out. The journey takes them through downtown Raccoon City, where the outbreak's full scope becomes undeniable. Bodies everywhere, fires consuming entire blocks, zombies in police uniforms, medical scrubs, business suits, children's clothing. The T-virus doesn't discriminate. It infected whoever was exposed, transforming the entire social fabric of a city into a hunting ground where the dead vastly outnumber the living. Leon and Claire reach the Raccoon City Police Department, a massive Gothic structure that looks more like a cathedral than a municipal building. The architecture is excessive, grandiose in ways that suggest either the city had enormous budgets for civic construction, or someone wanted the police station to double as something else. In this case, that something else is a museum. The building was originally an art museum before being converted to police use, explaining the elaborate architectural features that make it simultaneously beautiful and nightmarish to navigate. Inside, Leon and Claire find a handful of survivors, including Brian Irons, the police chief who's been on Umbrella's payroll for years. Irons has descended into complete madness during the outbreak, killing surviving officers and civilians while indulging sadistic impulses that his position previously forced him to restrain. He's not trying to help anyone escape. He's using the outbreak as an opportunity to act on desires that normal social constraints prevented, treating the apocalypse as permission for atrocity. Leon and Claire split up inside the station, each taking different routes through the building, searching for supplies, survivors, and ways to reach the underground parking area, where they might find vehicles capable of breaking through barricades, blocking evacuation routes. Their paths diverge, creating two separate experiences of the same nightmare. Leon encounters Ada Wong. She presents herself as an FBI agent investigating Umbrella Corporation, and she needs his help accessing secure areas of the police station to gather evidence. Ada is competent, professional, and very clearly hiding aspects of her real mission. Leon helps her anyway, partly because cooperation makes survival more likely, partly because he's drawn to her in ways that override his instincts, telling him she's not being fully honest. Claire encounters Sherry Birkin, a young girl hiding in the police station after fleeing from something she doesn't fully understand. Sherry is the daughter of William and Annette Birkin, Umbrella scientists who've been conducting some of the most classified research in the corporation's archives. Her presence in the police station during an outbreak is suspicious, suggesting her parents knew something was coming and tried to get her to safety. The police station connects to underground facilities through secret passages. Leon and Claire independently discover that Umbrella built laboratories directly beneath Raccoon City, using municipal infrastructure as camouflage for weapons development programs that violate international treaties. These laboratories are where the T-virus escaped, where containment failure initiated the outbreak, and where something far worse than zombies is currently loose. William Birkin had been developing something called the G-virus, a viral strain even more powerful and mutagenic than the T-virus. The G-virus could regenerate damaged tissue, adaptively evolve in response to threats, and most disturbing, reproduce by implanting embryos into living hosts. Where the T-virus created zombies, the G-virus created something that retained intelligence while gaining abilities that bordered on superhuman. Umbrella ordered extraction of the G-virus sample Birkin had been developing. When he refused, when he made it clear he intended to sell his research to the military for personal profit, rather than handing it over to Spencer, Umbrella sent security teams to retrieve the virus by force. They shot Birkin multiple times, leaving him to die in his laboratory while they took his research. Birkin survived long enough to inject himself with the G-virus. The transformation was immediate and catastrophic. His body mutated rapidly, growing additional mass and limbs, developing natural armor plating and biological weapon systems. His intelligence remained partially intact, but his personality fractured under the strain of continuous mutation. He became something that looked human from certain angles, but was clearly no longer William Birkin in any meaningful sense. In his mutated state, Birkin destroyed the laboratory, killed the security team, and shattered vials containing the T-virus. Rats infesting the sewer systems beneath the lab carried the virus throughout the city's water infrastructure, initiating the outbreak that consumed Raccoon City in less than a week. Now Birkin is hunting through the underground, driven by instincts that include protecting his daughter, even though he barely recognizes her anymore. When he encounters Sherry, something in his mutated consciousness identifies her as important, leading him to implant a G-virus embryo in her body. The embryo will kill her unless Claire can find a vaccine, forcing another desperate journey through zombie-infested laboratories to save a child who's become collateral damage in corporate warfare. Leon's path intersects with something else Umbrella deployed, the T-103, codenamed Mr. X. This is a Tyrant-class bioweapon similar to what Chris and Jill fought in the Spencer Mansion, but mass-produced and deployed in Raccoon City, ostensibly to eliminate witnesses who might testify about Umbrella's role in the outbreak. Mr. X stalks Leon through the police station and underground facilities with mechanical precision, immune to most damage, capable of tracking targets across huge distances. The pursuits become psychological horror. You can temporarily stop Mr. X by inflicting enough damage, creating brief windows to run and hide, but the creature never truly stops. It keeps coming, walking through doors and walls, its footsteps audible from rooms away, creating constant pressure where safety never lasts long enough to feel secure. Ada reveals her true purpose eventually. She's not FBI. She's a mercenary hired through black market channels to steal the G-virus sample, competing with Umbrella's official extraction teams. Her entire investigation story was cover for corporate espionage, and Leon's assistance gave her access to areas she couldn't have reached alone. When Leon discovers the truth, when Annette Birkin shoots Ada in a confrontation about who has rights to research that's killed thousands of people, the betrayal feels personal, even though Ada was never obligated to be honest with someone she met hours ago during an apocalypse. Ada falls from a catwalk, apparently dying from gunshot wounds and the fall. Leon grieves briefly, then continues because survival demands forward movement regardless of loss. What he doesn't see is Ada surviving the fall, aided by someone or something that pulls her to safety before the laboratories explode in yet another self-destruct sequence designed to eliminate evidence. Claire successfully finds a G-virus vaccine and administers it to Sherry, destroying the embryo before it can mature and kill the child from inside. But the process leaves Sherry infected with dormant G-virus cells that will affect her development, making her biologically valuable to anyone interested in studying how the virus affects children during their formative years. William Birkin, now mutated beyond any recognizable humanity, attacks Leon and Claire in the underground train station where they're trying to escape. The creature has evolved through multiple forms, each transformation adding new weapons and defenses as the G-virus continuously rewrites its biology in response to damage. The final battle requires every remaining bullet, every explosive device they've scavenged, every desperate tactic that might give them seconds more survival time. They kill Birkin finally, destroying enough of the creature's biological mass that even G-virus regeneration can't sustain it. They board the train and escape through underground tunnels as the laboratory explodes above them, collapsing sections of downtown Raccoon City and creating additional casualties beyond the thousands already killed by the outbreak. The train emerges outside city limits. Leon, Claire, and Sherry are alive, traumatized, and carrying knowledge about Umbrella that makes them liabilities the corporation will eventually need to address. Leon will be recruited into government service, his first-hand experience with bioweapons making him valuable for assignments where ordinary agents wouldn't understand the threats. Claire will continue searching for her brother while becoming involved in humanitarian efforts, helping outbreak survivors, and Sherry will disappear into protective custody, too valuable as a G-virus host to be allowed freedom. But before they can process any of this, before they can begin recovering from a night that felt like weeks, Jill Valentine is still fighting through the city with Carlos, still being hunted by Nemesis, still trying to reach evacuation points that keep getting overrun or destroyed. Carlos returns with the vaccine. Jill's infection is reversed, but the ordeal has left her weakened, running on adrenaline and determination rather than actual physical reserves. They need to escape Raccoon City before the infection spreads beyond containment, before whatever authorities are watching this catastrophe decide that the only solution is complete eradication, because the United States government has been monitoring the outbreak. They know Umbrella caused it. They know thousands of American citizens are dying in a bioweapon test disguised as an industrial accident. And they've decided that containing information about what happened matters more than rescuing survivors. The plan is simple and monstrous. Sterilize Raccoon City completely. Use enough explosive force to eliminate every trace of the T-virus, every bioweapon Umbrella deployed, every witness who might testify about what they saw. The official story will call it a tragic accident, maybe a gas leak or industrial explosion. Nobody will ever know that an American city was deliberately destroyed to protect corporate secrets and government complicity in illegal bioweapons research. Jill and Carlos discover this plan through intercepted military communications. They have hours before the missile strike, maybe less. The evacuation routes have been deliberately closed. Umbrella wants data on how long survivors can last against sustained bioweapon pressure. The government wants plausible deniability that anyone important knew what was really happening. And thousands of civilians are trapped between these two institutional priorities, about to be cremated to protect secrets they never knew existed. Nemesis attacks again. The creature has been damaged repeatedly during its pursuit of Jill, losing parts of its body to gunfire and explosions. But the T-virus that created it also grants regenerative abilities, allowing Nemesis to repair damage and continue functioning long after normal organisms would have died. Each encounter leaves it more damaged but also more dangerous, as though the bioweapon is learning from each confrontation, adapting tactics to counter Jill's strategies. The final battle occurs at a laboratory facility where Umbrella was conducting some of its most classified research. Nemesis has mutated beyond its original design parameters, becoming something even more monstrous than what was deployed. The creature's body has become more organic and less controlled, tentacles and additional limbs sprouting from wounds, the bioweapon consuming itself in pursuit of the single objective it was programmed to complete. Jill and Carlos destroy Nemesis using weapons salvaged from the facility, including an experimental railgun that delivers enough kinetic force to tear through even regenerative tissue. The creature finally stops moving, its body too damaged to reconstruct functional anatomy, even with T-virus enhancement. They reach an evacuation helicopter moments before the missile strikes. The city disappears in fire bright enough to be visible from orbit, heat intense enough to vaporize organic matter instantly. Everything burns, the zombies, the remaining survivors, the evidence of what Umbrella created and what the government allowed. Raccoon City becomes a crater, and the official death toll will list over 100,000 casualties, attributed to an industrial accident involving chemical plants. The survivors scatter. Some will try to continue normal lives, carrying trauma that makes normalcy impossible. Others will become activists, attempting to expose Umbrella despite knowing that powerful institutions have invested heavily in maintaining the cover story. A few will be recruited into government programs that recognize the value of people who've survived bioweapon exposure and understand threats that most intelligence analysts only know from briefings. Leon Kennedy becomes a government agent, assigned to missions involving bioterrorism and corporate malfeasance. His first day as a cop in Raccoon City becomes his last day in conventional law enforcement, replaced by a career navigating the shadow world where corporations and governments conduct wars without declaring them, and casualties never make official records. Claire Redfield continues searching for her brother Chris, who's somewhere in Europe investigating Umbrella facilities. She'll eventually find him, but the reunion will happen during another outbreak, another crisis where survival takes priority over catching up on missed time. And Jill Valentine will join Chris in his crusade against Umbrella, forming the foundation of what becomes the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance. a private organization dedicated to preventing what happened to Raccoon City from happening anywhere else. But Umbrella Corporation isn't finished. The destruction of Raccoon City was catastrophic for their operations, destroying research facilities and eliminating personnel who possess decades of institutional knowledge. But Umbrella has always operated through distributed networks, maintaining facilities worldwide so that no single disaster could eliminate the entire organization. The spider is wounded, but it has many legs, and some of them are still operational. Chapter 6: The Empire's Remaining Strongholds. December 1998. Claire Redfield has been searching for Chris for months, following leads that take her to Paris, where intelligence suggests Umbrella maintains a major facility. She infiltrates the compound, hoping to find information about her brother's location, but the operation goes wrong. Umbrella security captures her and transfers her to a remote island facility called Rockfort Island, a privately owned installation in the South Atlantic that functions as both prison and research complex. Rockfort Island represents Umbrella's willingness to build infrastructure in international waters where oversight effectively doesn't exist. The island houses a detention center for people Umbrella wants disappeared, employees who know too much, corporate rivals who discovered sensitive information, civilians who survived outbreaks and pose legal risks. It also contains laboratories conducting research that even Umbrella's more accessible facilities won't touch. Claire wakes in a cell with no trial, no legal representation, no official record of her arrest. She's simply another person who ceased to exist, removed from the world by an organization that treats human rights as obstacles rather than ethical boundaries. But before Umbrella can decide what to do with her, the island experiences an outbreak. T-virus infection spreads through the facility with horrifying speed. Guards become zombies. Researchers who thought their bioweapons expertise made them safe discovered that viruses don't recognize professional courtesy. The prison population and staff are dying or transforming, and the island is turning into another contained apocalypse. Claire escapes during the chaos and encounters Steve Burnside, a young prisoner whose father worked for Umbrella before attempting to sell secrets to competitors. Umbrella arrested the entire family, imprisoning Steve and his parents on Rockfort Island as punishment for his father's betrayal. Steve's parents are already dead, killed during the outbreak or transformed into zombies he's had to destroy himself. The trauma has left him emotionally volatile, swinging between desperate attempts at normalcy and barely controlled rage at the corporation that destroyed his family. The outbreak's source becomes clear as Claire explores the facility. Alfred Ashford, descendant of Edward Ashford, one of Umbrella's original founders, has been living on Rockfort Island, maintaining the family's involvement in Umbrella operations. But Alfred is profoundly mentally ill, his personality fractured by abuse and isolation. He believes his sister Alexia is still with him, speaking to her as though she's present even though she's been in cryogenic stasis for 15 years in an Antarctic facility. Alfred switches between his own personality and an Alexia persona he's constructed, creating dissociative episodes where he becomes his sister, adopting her mannerisms and speech patterns. The outbreak occurred because Alfred released bioweapons during one of these episodes, either deliberately as punishment for trespassers or accidentally during psychotic break. Regardless of cause, the result is another facility overrun with creatures that should never have been created. Claire and Steve fight their way to an escape plane, but Alfred redirects the aircraft's autopilot mid-flight, sending them to Antarctica, where Umbrella maintains the facility where Alexia is being held. The Antarctic base is even more isolated than Rockfort Island, built into ice shelves, where environmental conditions make contamination spread slower, and facility destruction easier if necessary. Alfred dies shortly after their arrival, killed during combat with Claire. But his death triggers automated systems that begin waking Alexia from cryostasis. She's been frozen for 15 years after deliberately infecting herself with something she called the T. Veronica virus, a variant she developed by combining the progenitor virus with the DNA of an ancient queen, ant, and plant genetic material. Alexia Ashford was a genius who discovered at age 10 that she was a clone rather than a naturally born child, created through her father Alexander's attempt to resurrect the Ashford family's scientific reputation. The revelation shattered whatever psychological stability a child prodigy might have possessed, replacing it with an obsessive need to prove herself superior to the original founders of Umbrella. She created the T. Veronica virus as demonstration that her research exceeded anything Spencer, Marcus, or her grandfather Edward had accomplished. The virus granted superhuman abilities but required a specific adaptation period, hence the 15-year cryosleep, allowing the infection to integrate with her biology slowly enough that she'd retain intelligence while gaining power. Now awakened, Alexia represents one of the most dangerous bioweapons Umbrella ever produced, except she was never loyal to Umbrella. She views the corporation as beneath her, a commercial venture that polluted her family's scientific legacy with profit motives. Chris Redfield arrives at the Antarctic facility separately, tracking leads about Umbrella operations that lead him to the same location where his sister is trapped. The reunion happens during active combat against bioweapons and Alexia herself, making any emotional reconciliation secondary to immediate survival. Albert Wesker also appears, revealing that he survived the events at the Spencer mansion. The tyrant's attack didn't kill him. It activated a dormant virus Spencer had infected him with decades earlier during the orphanage experiments. Wesker possesses superhuman strength, speed, and reflexes, making him something between human and bioweapon. He's no longer working for Umbrella, having gone independent to pursue his own vision of human evolution through viral enhancement. Wesker wants the T. Veronica virus, recognizing its potential for creating the superhuman future he believes humanity needs. He fights Chris briefly, demonstrating abilities that make him faster and stronger than any naturally evolved human. But when he attempts to capture Alexia, she proves powerful enough to fight him off, forcing him to retreat without the sample he came for. Chris and Claire battle Alexia through multiple transformations as the T. Veronica virus causes her body to evolve in real time, developing new weapons and defenses. She eventually becomes more insect than human, a grotesque fusion of human intelligence and arthropod biology that can shoot fire from modified organs and regenerate damage that should be fatal. They kill her finally, using explosives and concentrated firepower to overwhelm regenerative abilities. Steve Burnside dies during the conflict, infected with T. Veronica after Alexia used him as a test subject. His death is unnecessary, tragic in the specific way that casualties in corporate wars always are. He had no connection to the conspiracy, no involvement in Umbrella's decisions, just wrong place at the wrong time repeatedly until time ran out. Wesker takes Steve's body when he leaves, recognizing that the corpse contains T. Veronica antibodies that might be useful for future research. Chris and Claire escape as the Antarctic facility self-destructs, another Umbrella installation erased from existence. The Code Veronica incident accomplishes something significant in the timeline's broader trajectory. It demonstrates that Umbrella's facilities exist worldwide, that the corporation's infrastructure extends far beyond the United States, and that destroying one installation or even several doesn't meaningfully damage an organization with resources and backup locations across multiple continents, but it also reveals cracks in Umbrella's operational security. Too many outbreaks, too many facility destructions, Too much evidence that can't all be contained. The corporation is hemorrhaging credibility, accumulating legal liability faster than its lawyers can construct defenses, and former employees who witnessed atrocities are starting to cooperate with investigators, trading testimony for immunity deals. The next several years see Umbrella fighting battles on multiple fronts. Military contracts get canceled as governments distance themselves from a corporation that's become a public relations disaster. Intelligence agencies that previously collaborated with Umbrella's research started conducting raids instead, seizing documents and arresting personnel. Media investigations proliferate, making the cover stories harder to maintain. In 2002, Leon Kennedy and another operative named Jack Krauser are sent to South America on an operation investigating a drug cartel leader named Javier Hidalgo. The mission, designated Operation Javier, discovers that Hidalgo has been using Umbrella bioweapons to maintain control over his territory and has infected his own daughter with a virus attempting to save her from terminal illness. Leon and Krauser destroy Hidalgo's operation, but Krauser is infected during combat. The infection doesn't transform him into a zombie or obvious bioweapon, but it leaves him changed, physically enhanced, but also psychologically damaged in ways that will later make him vulnerable to recruitment by groups that view bioweapon enhancement as evolution rather than disease. 2003 marks the beginning of Umbrella Corporation's final collapse. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, now senior members of the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, track one of Umbrella's last operational facilities to Russia. The base houses the Talos Project, an attempt to create mass-produced tyrants that could be deployed as military units. Chris and Jill infiltrate the Russian facility, fighting through experimental bioweapons that represent Umbrella's last desperate attempts at creating products that might salvage the corporation's viability. They destroy the Talos Project, eliminating years of research. Then Wesker appears. He has his own agenda regarding Umbrella's downfall, not preventing it, but accelerating it in ways that serve his interests. He breaks into the facility's data storage, downloads decades of research, and leaks everything to media outlets and international law enforcement simultaneously. The leak is catastrophic for Umbrella. Classified research becomes public knowledge. Evidence of human experimentation can no longer be denied or dismissed. Governments that had been protecting the corporation are forced to initiate legal proceedings to avoid complicity accusations. Within months, Umbrella Corporation declares bankruptcy, its assets seized by governments, its leadership facing criminal charges that will take years to prosecute. Oswell Spencer, the original founder who murdered his partners and built an empire on weaponized biology, disappears. He'll spend the next several years in hiding, protected by resources he squirreled away before the collapse, waiting for opportunities to rebuild or pass his vision to successors who might complete what he started. Umbrella's fall should represent triumph for everyone who fought against it. But the bioweapons research doesn't disappear with the corporation. The knowledge exists in databases that got copied before seizure. Former researchers take their expertise to new employers. And the geopolitical landscape has changed in ways that make bioweapons more attractive rather than less. The war on terror created demand for asymmetric weapons that could destabilize regions without conventional military deployment. Corporate espionage escalated into corporate warfare, with businesses hiring mercenaries to steal competitors' research and sabotage operations. And new organizations emerged to fill the void Umbrella left, recognizing that profits from weaponized biology remained enormous for anyone willing to ignore ethics and international treaties. Leon Kennedy, now an experienced government agent, is assigned to investigate one of these situations. Reports suggest that a remote village in rural Spain has experienced some kind of outbreak or mass behavioral change, and the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, was kidnapped and taken to that region. The assignment combines rescue operation with bioterrorism investigation, requiring someone with Leon's specific expertise. 2004. Leon arrives in Spain and discovers something different from previous outbreaks he's encountered. The villagers aren't zombies. They move with coordination, use weapons, speak to each other, and demonstrate intelligence that T-virus infection eliminates. But they're clearly not normal. Their behavior shows signs of external control. They attack strangers with murderous efficiency, and they worship something they call Las Plagas. Las Plagas is a parasitic organism, not a virus. The parasite embeds in the host's nervous system, granting the controlling entity the ability to influence or override the host's behavior while leaving cognitive functions largely intact. Infected individuals retain their skills, memories, and problem-solving abilities, but their loyalty and motivations can be redirected by whoever controls the parasite. This represents a different kind of bioweapon threat. Where the T-virus created chaos, Las Plagas creates control. An army of intelligent humans who follow orders perfectly, who can infiltrate societies without detection because they appear normal, who might not even realize they're being controlled until activation signals make them turn on their neighbors. The village is controlled by a cult called Los Iluminados, led by a man named Osmond Sadler. The cult has been using Las Plagas to dominate the local population, transforming an isolated religious community into a bioweapon testing ground. Sadler has ambitions beyond the village. He arranged Ashley's kidnapping specifically to infect her with Las Plagas and send her back to the United States, where the parasite would mature and allow him to control the president's daughter. Leon fights through the village and surrounding areas, encountering upgraded versions of Las Plagas infections that create boss-level threats. He runs into Ada Wong again, alive despite apparently dying in Raccoon City 6 years earlier. She's working for someone. Her exact employer remains deliberately vague, but she's clearly pursuing her own objectives involving Las Plagas samples rather than simply helping Leon. Jack Krauser appears as well, now working for Wesker and having fully embraced the bioweapon enhancement he received during Operation Javier. Krauser views his infection as evolution, as transcendence beyond weak human limitations. He's been assigned to retrieve Las Plagas for Wesker's research, creating a situation where multiple factions are competing for the same biological weapon, while Leon is simply trying to rescue Ashley and survive. Leon kills Krauser after a fight that demonstrates how much bioweapon enhancement can improve combat capabilities. He destroys Sadler using weapons provided by Ada, who escapes with Las Plagas samples, fulfilling her actual mission while leaving Leon to handle the aftermath. Leon and Ashley escape the region as facilities explode in yet another pattern that's becoming darkly predictable. They're both infected with Las Plagas, but specialized equipment removes the parasites before they mature. Ashley returns to her father's protection with trauma that will require years of processing. Leon returns to government service with yet another mission completed and yet another bioweapon threat spreading into black markets, where it will proliferate beyond any possible containment. Ada delivers her Las Plagas sample to Wesker, who now possesses one of the most sophisticated bioweapons ever developed. His long-term plans remain unclear, but they involve creating some kind of evolutionary pressure that will force humanity to adapt or die, believing that only through biological crises can humans transcend their current limitations. The years that follow see bioweapon threats proliferate globally. What Umbrella started has metastasized beyond any single corporation's control, becoming a permanent feature of the geopolitical landscape. Organizations like the BSAA work to contain outbreaks and prevent deployment, but they're fighting a losing battle against market forces that make bioweapons research profitable and geopolitical dynamics that make such weapons strategically useful. Chris and Jill continue their work with the BSAA, investigating leads about Oswell Spencer's location. In 2006, they finally track him to a mansion where he's been hiding. They infiltrate the location, fighting through defenses, reaching Spencer's chamber. They find him already dead. Wesker arrived first, confronting his creator and murdering the man who'd infected him with the virus that made him superhuman. Whatever Wesker learned during that confrontation, whatever questions he finally got answered about his origins and purpose, it doesn't matter to Chris and Jill except that justice has been denied. Wesker attacks them. Jill recognizes they can't win in direct combat. He's too fast, too strong, enhanced far beyond what military training can overcome. She makes a decision that defines her entire character, tackling Wesker through a window, both of them falling from a height that should be fatal. Chris finds no bodies below. Jill is declared dead, killed in action during the pursuit of humanity's most dangerous bioterrorist. Chris carries that loss for the next 3 years, believing his partner sacrificed herself to save him and prevent Wesker from completing whatever apocalyptic plan he was pursuing. The truth is more complicated and far worse. Chapter 7. When Gods Played with Viruses. 2009. Chris Redfield has spent 3 years grieving Jill and hunting Wesker with intensity that borders on obsessive. The BSAA assigns him to Africa with a new partner, Shiva Alamar, investigating reports of illegal bioweapons deals in the region. The mission appears routine by BSAA standards. Identify sellers, track buyers, seize samples before deployment. The operation escalates immediately. The African location isn't just a deal location. It's where Wesker is conducting research using facilities built by Tricell, a pharmaceutical corporation that absorbed many of Umbrella's assets after its collapse. Tricell has continued bioweapons research under new corporate branding, demonstrating that destroying one company doesn't eliminate the market incentives that made bioweapon development profitable. Chris discovers something that redefines every priority he has. Jill is alive. She survived the fall 3 years ago, but Wesker captured her and has been using her as a test subject and control mechanism. She's infected with a virus that allows external control, wearing a device that overrides her volition and forces her to serve Wesker, despite her desperate attempts to resist. The confrontation between Chris and Control Jill is psychological horror made physical. He's fighting someone he trusts completely, someone whose reflexes and combat training make her extraordinarily dangerous, someone who's silently pleading for him to stop her even as the control device forces her to try killing him. Chris and Shiva remove the control device. Jill collapses, freed from months of being a prisoner in her own body, aware of everything she's been forced to do while unable to stop herself. The trauma of that experience will mark her permanently, creating psychological wounds that simple survival can't heal. But there's no time for recovery. Wesker's plan is already in motion. He's obtained the progenitor, virus, the original viral strain that spawned everything from the T-virus to T. veronica. He's located the flower Spencer's expedition discovered decades ago, the stairway to the sun growing in African soil. And he's created something called Ouroboros, a virus designed to force rapid evolution, killing most of humanity while transforming a small fraction into superhuman beings worthy of inheriting the Earth. This is Spencer's vision finally realized, but taken to its most extreme conclusion. Wesker believes humanity, in its current form, is a failed experiment, weak and stagnant. Ouroboros will function as global selection pressure, eliminating the unworthy while evolving the worthy into something better. From Wesker's perspective, this isn't genocide. It's enforced evolution, saving humanity from itself. The BSAA's founders, the organization Chris and Jill helped establish, turn out to be complicit. Tricell executives who funded the BSAA did so to gain access to bioweapon intelligence and samples, using the organization as unwitting collectors for their own research programs. The revelation is devastating but predictable. Institutions created to fight bioweapon proliferation get captured by the same profit motives that drove Umbrella, because systemic incentives don't change just because one company falls. Chris, Jill, and Shiva pursue Wesker to a volcano facility where he's preparing to deploy Ouroboros globally using missiles that will distribute the virus to major population centers. The confrontation becomes increasingly desperate as Wesker injects himself with additional viral samples, enhancing his abilities beyond anything previously witnessed while also destabilizing his biology. The volcano provides a poetic final battlefield. Wesker, who styled himself as humanity's evolutionary superior, dies drowning in lava, consumed by the same heat that creates New Earth. His death eliminates the immediate Ouroboros threat but doesn't undo the damage his existence caused or eliminate the research he conducted. Chris finally gets closure on Jill's disappearance, but at the cost of understanding exactly what she endured. Shiva proves herself as a partner and friend, someone who can operate in the moral complexity that bioterrorism creates without losing sight of the underlying humanitarian mission, and the BSAA survives its corruption scandal, restructuring to prevent similar infiltration while acknowledging that no institution is immune to the profit motives that make bioweapons research persist despite catastrophic consequences. The years between 2009 and 2013 see continued proliferation. New organizations emerge to replace Umbrella and Tricell. Former researchers sell expertise to the highest bidders, and samples of every virus ever created circulate in black markets where governments, corporations, and terrorist organizations compete to acquire them. 2013 brings chaos on a different scale. Multiple bioterrorist incidents occur simultaneously across the globe. In the fictional country of Edonia, in the United States, in China. The attacks appear coordinated, suggesting an organization with resources and reach exceeding anything previously encountered. The C virus emerges as the new threat, another variant combining elements of previous viruses to create zombies with enhanced capabilities. Jake Muller discovers he's the son of Albert Wesker, inheriting immunity to certain viruses that makes his blood potentially valuable as a basis for vaccines. Sherry Birkin, now an adult government agent still carrying dormant G virus from her childhood infection, is assigned to protect Jake. Leon Kennedy finds himself in the United States protecting the president when an outbreak occurs at a gathering where the president planned to reveal the truth about Raccoon City and Umbrella's crimes. The president becomes infected and Leon is forced to kill him, eliminating the one person in authority willing to publicly acknowledge institutional failures that enabled bioweapon proliferation. Chris Redfield commands BSAA forces in combat against bioweapons in multiple locations, experiencing traumatic losses when squad members are killed by bioweapons designed specifically to counter BSAA tactics. The conspiracy behind the attacks traces back to Derek Simmons, a government official who's been manipulating events to maintain geopolitical stability through controlled bioterrorism, using outbreaks as tools of statecraft. The revelation is damning. Bioweapons have become so normalized, so integrated into how power operates, that government officials now deploy them as standard elements of foreign and domestic policy. What started as corporate malfeasance has evolved into systematic, institutional corruption, where bioterrorism is simply another tool in the toolbox, deployed by people who've concluded that using such weapons is unfortunate but necessary. The survivors destroy Simmons' operations and prevent global C virus deployment. but the structural problems remain unsolved and possibly unsolvable. The knowledge exists, the market incentives persist, and enough institutional actors have decided bioweapons are acceptable tools that preventing future outbreaks requires fighting both criminals and government simultaneously. This creates exhaustion in ways that simple physical trauma doesn't. Chris, Leon, Jill, all the original survivors of the Spencer Mansion, have been fighting bioterrorism for 15 years. They've prevented global catastrophes, saved millions of lives, eliminated numerous bioterrorist organizations. And despite all that effort, threats are worse in 2013 than in 1998 because success didn't eliminate the underlying dynamics. It just meant new players entered the game. The timeline needs to shift now to different threats, different types of horror that connect to bioweapons but emerge from different sources. Chapter 8: When Corporations Became the Virus. 2014, Louisiana. A tanker ship runs aground near a plantation house owned by the Baker family. Jack, Marguerite, their son Lucas, and an elderly woman named Eveline who's been living with them. The Bakers are the kind of people who define Southern hospitality, offering help to strangers, maintaining community ties, living quietly in a region where families measure their history in generations rather than decades. The ship carries a young girl, maybe 10 years old, accompanied by a woman named Mia, who presents as her caretaker. The Bakers find them on the shore, disoriented and claiming memory loss about how they got there. Jack and Marguerite bring them home, offering shelter while they contact authorities. Within days, the Baker family changes. Jack becomes violent in ways that contradict his entire personality, attacking family members and strangers with methodical cruelty. Marguerite develops obsessive behaviors, creating insect infestations throughout the house while speaking about family in ways that suggest her concept of maternal care has twisted into something nightmarish. Lucas, already disturbed before the ship arrived, descends into sadistic experimentation, treating captured victims as subjects for elaborate torture scenarios he designs like puzzle games. The girl, Eveline, is the source. She's not actually 10 years old. She's a bioorganic weapon created by an organization called the Connections, a successor to Umbrella's research programs. Eveline was designed as the perfect infiltration weapon, a child that would trigger protective instincts in targets, allowing her to enter secure locations where obvious threats would be stopped. Once inside, she'd infect everyone nearby with a mold-based bioweapon that granted her complete control over their behavior. This brings the timeline full circle. The Connections obtained samples of Miranda's mold from Eastern Europe, recognizing that fungal bioweapons offered advantages over viral agents. Where viruses killed hosts or degraded their cognitive abilities, the mold could preserve intelligence while granting external control. Eveline represents weaponized versions of what Miranda spent a century researching, stripped of any pretense about resurrection or scientific curiosity, purely designed to dominate and control. But Eveline's psychological profile was flawed from creation. The Connections gave her the appearance and emotional needs of a child without considering what that would mean for a bioweapon that never ages. Eveline desperately wants family, wants to be loved and protected, wants normalcy that her nature makes impossible. The Baker family became her surrogate family through infection rather than choice, forced to play roles in Eveline's delusion while retaining enough awareness to understand what's been stolen from them. 3 years pass. The Baker property becomes known locally as a place to avoid, somewhere that swallows visitors who never return. Local authorities receive reports, but investigations get shut down through Connections' interference. The organization wants to study Eveline's long-term effects on hosts, documenting how the mold infection progresses and whether control remains stable over years. 2017. Ethan Winters receives a message from his wife Mia, who disappeared 3 years ago during a work assignment she couldn't discuss. The message asks him to come to Louisiana, providing an address in Dulvey. Ethan goes, driving to the Baker plantation because his wife is asking, and 3 years of absence deserve answers even when circumstances suggest the answers will be terrible. Ethan is aggressively normal. He's not military trained like Chris or Leon. He's not a researcher who understands bioweapons. He's a systems engineer who fixed computers for a living before his wife vanished. His normalcy becomes his defining characteristic. Ethan doesn't have special skills or resources. He just refuses to stop moving forward because stopping means dying or abandoning Mia. The Baker house is a horror show. Ethan discovers Mia in the basement, finds her shifting between lucidity and violent episodes where she attacks him with lethal intent. He's captured by Jack Baker, who drags him to a dinner table where the family acts out grotesque parody of normal meals, while their bodies demonstrate signs of advanced mold infection, regenerating severed limbs, surviving injuries that should be instantly fatal, moving with coordination that requires external control. Ethan fights through the plantation, gradually understanding that the Bakers aren't villains so much as victims, forced to perform villainy by infection they can't resist. Jack's violence comes with apologies, moments where his real personality surfaces long enough to beg Ethan to run before the mold reasserts control. Marguerite's maternal obsession includes genuine grief about what she's become, distorted through infection into something that expresses love through violence. Lucas represents a different problem. His infection never fully controlled him. He's been taking a serum the connections provided that suppresses the mold's control mechanisms. He's acting out sadistic impulses voluntarily, using the family's infection as cover for behavior that reflects his actual personality rather than Eveline's manipulation. This makes him more disturbing than his parents, someone who could have helped his family, but instead used their suffering as an opportunity for indulging cruelty. Ethan discovers the truth about Mia through documents scattered throughout the property. She worked for the connections as Eveline's handler, responsible for transporting the bioweapon to an unspecified location. The ship ran aground because Eveline escaped containment during transport, infecting crew and forcing Mia to crash the vessel, rather than allow it to reach port with an active bioweapon. Mia's infection is why she attacked Ethan, why she sent the message luring him to Louisiana. Eveline has been using her as bait, wanting Ethan to join the family, forcing Mia to participate in the trap despite her attempts to resist. The revelation recontextualizes everything. Mia isn't choosing violence. She's desperately trying to warn Ethan while infection makes her body act against her will. Ethan confronts Eveline in the Baker house's depths. The little girl reveals she's been aging rapidly despite her bioweapon design, the mold infection degrading her appearance until she resembles elderly woman rather than a child. Her desperation for family has intensified as her body fails, creating psychological pressure that makes her control over the Bakers more violent and her need for Ethan more absolute. Ethan kills Eveline using a specialized toxin developed by the connections for eliminating failed bioweapons. Eveline's death releases the Bakers from infection, though Jack and Marguerite have been too damaged to survive freedom. Lucas escapes, continuing to work with the connections because his sadism found institutional home in an organization that values people willing to conduct atrocity without ethical constraint. Chris Redfield appears as Ethan and Mia are extracted from the property. He's working for Blue Umbrella, a reformed version of the corporation supposedly dedicated to cleaning up bioweapon proliferation caused by the original Umbrella. The reveal is jarring. Chris working for any organization carrying the Umbrella name seems like betrayal of everything he's fought for. But the bioweapon industry has become so entrenched that even former enemies get rehabilitated when institutions decide their expertise is more valuable than accountability for past crimes. Ethan and Mia relocate to Europe under BSAA protection, attempting to build a normal life from trauma that makes normalcy impossible. Mia becomes pregnant. They have a daughter named Rose. The connections maintain interest in the family because Mia's infection might have affected the pregnancy, potentially creating a child with innate mold resistance or integration that would be scientifically valuable. This sets up the return to where everything started, back to Miranda and the village, back to the cave where a grieving mother discovered something that would eventually spawn an industry built on transforming grief into weapons. Chapter 9. The Return to Origins. 2021. Ethan and Mia are living in Eastern Europe with infant Rose, protected by Chris Redfield and the BSAA. The location was chosen for its isolation, somewhere the connections would struggle to reach. What nobody realized was they'd relocated to the region where Miranda has been conducting experiments for over a century, where the mold originated, where the entire bioweapon industry's foundational research was first developed. Miranda has been watching the Baker situation from afar, recognizing her mold being weaponized by organizations that didn't understand its true potential. When she learns about Rose Winters, an infant possibly born with mold integration, she recognizes the opportunity she's been searching for across generations of failed experiments. Rose might be the perfect vessel for Eva's consciousness, a child whose biology has been prepared by her mother's infection to accept what Miranda wants to implant. Chris Redfield breaks into Ethan's home and shoots Mia in front of him. Ethan is captured along with Rose and transported in a vehicle that gets ambushed by lichens. The vehicle crashes. Rose is taken. Ethan wakes in the village Miranda has ruled for decades, surrounded by architecture that hasn't changed substantially since the 1920s, populated by people who worship the Black God and view Miranda as prophet. Walking through this village, Ethan experiences horror that's more cultural than biological. The buildings are medieval. The residents speak about ceremony and ritual in ways that suggest they've been doing this so long they've forgotten why it started. Children play games about lichens like American children play games about ghosts. The normalization is the horror. Bioweapon experimentation has become so embedded in this community's identity that nobody questions it anymore. Miranda has divided Rose into 4 parts, distributing them among the 4 lords, who rule different territories under her authority. This forces Ethan to visit each domain, experiencing different flavors of bioweapon horror while collecting pieces of his daughter. The mechanic transforms Rose into MacGuffin, but it also emphasizes how bioweapons research treats human bodies as raw materials that can be disassembled and studied without regard for personhood. Castle Dimitrescu introduces Lady Alcina Dimitrescu and her daughters, aristocratic vampires who are actually humans infected with Kadu parasites that grant regenerative abilities and create dependency on human blood. Dimitrescu views Ethan as prey and intruder, hunting him through her castle with her daughters, while demonstrating that bioweapon enhancement can maintain aesthetic refinement even as it eliminates empathy. House Beneviento presents psychological horror through Donna Beneviento, who uses mold-based hallucinogens and puppet manipulation to create environments where reality becomes unreliable. Ethan experiences hallucinations of his family, confronts fears about fatherhood and inadequacy, fights threats that might not exist outside his mind, while actual dangers hide within psychological warfare. The reservoir brings Salvatore Moreau, whose Kadu infection mutated him into something that looks aquatic and monstrous, while leaving him desperate for Miranda's approval. Moreau is a tragedy embodied, someone who views his transformation as a necessary sacrifice for higher purpose, who interprets Miranda's experimental interest as love, who spent years trying to earn affection from someone who sees him as a failed experiment. Heisenberg's factory combines industrial horror with bioweapon research, showing how manufacturing processes get applied to creating soldats, biomechanical fusion soldiers that combine human tissue with mechanical augmentation. Carl Heisenberg himself is a cyborg through Cadu infection, able to control magnetic fields and metal. He's been planning rebellion against Miranda, recognizing that she views all the lords as disposable tools rather than family. Heisenberg offers an alliance. Help him kill Miranda. Use Rose as a weapon against her. Ethan refuses because using his daughter as a weapon is exactly what Miranda plans, exactly the logic that's driven every atrocity in the timeline. Rose isn't a raw material or strategic asset. She's his child, and protecting her means rejecting every utilitarian calculation that treats human life as expendable in service of greater goals. The confrontation with Miranda forces revelations. Chris didn't actually kill Mia. He killed Miranda disguised as Mia, the real Mia having been kidnapped before Chris's raid. Miranda has been impersonating Mia for weeks, living with Ethan and Rose while planning how to use the child for Eva's resurrection. The deception recontextualizes Ethan's entire recent history, making him question every interaction with his wife, wondering how long the replacement had been happening. Miranda attempts her child's resurrection using Rose as a vessel. The process begins, but fails. Rose's consciousness is too strong, too individual to be overwritten, even by Miranda's century of accumulated knowledge about the mold. Eva can't return because Rose refuses to stop existing, fighting for her own identity in ways that Miranda's previous experimental subjects never managed. Then the timeline reveals its most devastating truth. Ethan died in Louisiana 3 years ago. Jack Baker killed him during the initial confrontation at the dinner table, and the mold infection from Eveline resurrected his body, maintaining his consciousness while his actual biology became fungal rather than human. Ethan has been walking corpse for 3 years, held together by the same organism that destroyed the Baker family. This revelation reframes every injury Ethan survived in Louisiana and the village. His hand getting cut off and reattached shouldn't work on normal human biology, but mold-based life repairs damage far beyond what mammalian healing can accomplish. His survival of injuries that would kill normal humans isn't heroism or luck. It's because he's not human anymore. Hasn't been since that first night in the Baker house. Ethan uses this realization strategically. If he's already dead, already beyond saving, then sacrifice becomes a simple tactical choice rather than tragedy. He uses a BSAA explosive device to destroy the megamycete, the massive mold colony beneath the village that's been powering Miranda's abilities and storing consciousnesses she's assimilated over a century. The explosion will kill Miranda, eliminate the mold that's enabled so much suffering, and destroy Ethan in the process. Chris extracts Mia and Rose. Ethan stays behind, watching his family escape in a helicopter, knowing they'll survive even though he won't. The explosion consumes the village, eliminating Miranda and the megamycete, ending a bloodline of horror that started with a grieving mother and a cave and a fungus that promised resurrection. But the explosion doesn't eliminate the mold from Rose. She carries it in her biology, inherited from her mother's infection and her father's resurrection. Growing up, Rose develops abilities that make her valuable to every organization interested in bioweapons research, putting her at risk of becoming exactly what her parents died trying to prevent: another human reduced to a strategic asset. Chapter 10: Cycles That Never Break. 2028. Leon S. Kennedy is older now, carrying 30 years of bioterrorism missions that have left visible marks. He's returning to Raccoon City for the first time since 1998, when the city was destroyed to contain Umbrella's outbreak. 3 decades later, Raccoon City has been partially rebuilt, no longer the crater it became, but not restored to what it was before the catastrophe. Requiem's setup remains partially classified, but the outline suggests Leon is investigating something connected to the original outbreak. The city might be physically rebuilt, but the contamination went deeper than architecture, into soil, water systems, the bedrock beneath where bodies were never properly recovered. Biological material from 30 years ago might still be viable, and organizations that inherited Umbrella's research would recognize the value of accessing ground zero where the T-virus first demonstrated its pandemic potential. Grace Ashcroft joins Leon's investigation from a different angle. Her mother, Alyssa, was a reporter in Raccoon City during the outbreak, someone who investigated Umbrella before the catastrophe. Alyssa died in 2018 at the Warren Hotel, officially from accident or natural causes, actually killed by someone with connections to Umbrella's successor organizations. Grace has been investigating her mother's death, following trails that lead back to Raccoon City and suggest Alyssa discovered something that made her elimination necessary, even 20 years after Umbrella's collapse. The Warren Hotel becomes a significant location in Requiem, suggesting that Alyssa's final investigation focused on something preserved or hidden in that building. Perhaps documents, perhaps biological samples, perhaps evidence that would demonstrate institutional continuity between Umbrella and its successors in ways that would undermine the reformed corporate narratives. Dr. Victor Gideon appears as antagonist or key figure, someone the U.S. government is hunting due to Umbrella connections. His involvement suggests that former Umbrella personnel remain active, that the expertise and research didn't disappear when the corporation collapsed, that institutional knowledge persists across organizational changes. What makes Requiem thematically significant is its return to origin sites. The Spencer Mansion burned, the underground laboratories were destroyed, but Raccoon City itself, the urban center where tens of thousands died, was never properly processed. Bodies were cremated in the initial missile strike, but biological contamination doesn't fully eliminated through fire. The T-virus might persist in forms that remain viable decades later, and the combination of rebuilt infrastructure with unremediated contamination creates conditions for new outbreaks or hybrid strains that combine historical viruses with modern variants. Leon and Grace represent different relationships to Raccoon City's trauma. Leon survived it directly, carrying first-hand experience of the outbreak's worst hours. Grace inherited it as a legacy, shaped by her mother's investigation and death, driven by a need to understand what killed a family she never properly knew. Their partnership embodies the timeline's generational transmission. Trauma and resistance both get passed down, creating new fighters against threats that refuse to fully die. 30 years after Raccoon City's destruction, the city's reconstruction becomes a metaphor for larger patterns. You can rebuild buildings, but the underlying dynamics that made the catastrophe possible persist. Corporate interest in bioweapons continues. Government complicity remains. The market incentives that made Umbrella profitable attracted successors who learned from Umbrella's mistakes without learning the fundamental lesson that weaponizing life creates risks no profit margin justifies. This creates exhaustion that isn't defeatism but realistic assessment of structural problems. Leon has been fighting bioterrorism for 3 decades. He's prevented global catastrophes, saved millions, eliminated bioterrorist organizations. Yet in 2028, he's back in Raccoon City fighting threats that shouldn't still exist because the systems that create such threats never actually changed. The question Requiem poses, though we won't know its answer until the game releases, is whether fighting is enough when victories don't eliminate underlying conditions. Whether heroism at individual level can address problems that exist at institutional and systemic levels. Whether preventing today's outbreak matters when tomorrow's is already being developed in laboratories that learned to hide better but never stopped operating. But the timeline doesn't end with Leon in Raccoon City. It ends with Rose Winters, 6 years after Requiem's events, carrying forward implications that began with Miranda's grief over a century earlier. 2037. Rose is 16 years old, raised by Mia, and protected by organizations that recognize her strategic value. She has powers inherited from mold integration, abilities that make her useful for combating bioweapons, but also make her target for groups that want to study or exploit her biology. Growing up as living bioweapon while trying to maintain some version of normal adolescence creates tensions that no amount of protective custody can resolve. Someone approaches Rose with an offer. Enter the Megamycete's remains, the consciousness stored in mold fragments that survived the village's destruction, and use those fragments to eliminate her powers. The offer promises normalcy, the chance to be a regular person without abilities that make her valuable to organizations she doesn't trust. Rose accepts, entering the mold consciousness, where she experiences fragmented memories from people the Megamycete assimilated over centuries. She encounters Miranda's presence, still existing as an information pattern within the fungal network. She sees her father Ethan, preserved in the mold's memory of his final moments. She experiences the accumulated trauma of everyone the mold infected or consumed, centuries of suffering crystallized into biological data storage. The journey through the Megamycete shows Rose what her powers actually mean. Their connection to legacy of grief weaponized into bioweapon research, to Miranda's century of experiments, to the connection's attempts at creating controllable weapons. Her abilities make her valuable because she represents successful integration of technology that killed thousands during development. Rose ultimately decides to keep her powers, not because she wants them, but because eliminating them wouldn't eliminate what they represent, or the threats they allow her to combat. She can't escape being a bioweapon any more than Leon can escape being a survivor. The categories have become permanent aspects of identity that no choice can fully undo. The final scene shows Rose at Ethan's grave, picked up by someone in a vehicle that another figure approaches from shadows. The implication suggests recruitment, new organizations recognizing her value, cycles continuing with new generations. Rose will fight bioweapon threats because she has the abilities and the legacy and the understanding that comes from being both victim and weapon simultaneously. This creates the timeline's closing statement. The fight against bioweapons doesn't end. It doesn't reach resolution where problems get solved and heroes retire. It continues across generations, each cycle introducing new fighters against threats that evolve faster than containment strategies. Rose represents the future of that fight. People born into conflict they didn't start, carrying abilities they didn't choose, trying to prevent atrocities that institutional incentives keep making profitable. The horror in Resident Evil was never really about the monsters. The monsters are symptoms of decisions made by people pursuing power, profit, or impossible resurrections. Miranda wanted her daughter back and created a fungus that would eventually be weaponized globally. Spencer wanted to perfect humanity and built a corporation that turned life into industrial product. Wesker wanted to force evolution and came within hours of deploying a virus that would have killed billions. Each believed their goals justified methods. Each constructed elaborate rationales for why their specific atrocity was necessary, temporary, acceptable cost for higher purpose. And each created horrors that outlasted their intentions. metastasizing into systems that continued producing catastrophes long after original architects were dead. The survivors, Chris, Leon, Jill, Claire, Rose, fight against those systems knowing that victory means preventing specific outbreaks rather than eliminating the conditions that make outbreaks inevitable. They save lives that can be saved while understanding that the underlying dynamics persist, that tomorrow's threat is already being developed in laboratories they haven't discovered yet, that corporate and government interest in bioweapons guarantees future catastrophes, regardless of how many current ones get prevented. This isn't defeatism. This is acknowledgement that systemic problems require systemic solutions, and individual heroism, while necessary and valuable, can't substitute for addressing root causes. The timeline spans from 1919 to 2034, covering 115 years of bioweapon development, from Miranda's cave to Rose's recruitment. Across that span, the technology evolved, the organizations changed names, the specific viral strains became more sophisticated, but the fundamental pattern remained constant. Powerful people deciding that weaponizing life served their interests, vulnerable people becoming experimental subjects, survivors fighting to prevent deployment, and institutions protecting research that should have been eliminated because profit and power and the belief that controlled application might succeed where previous attempts failed. Resident Evil's timeline is a tragedy that keeps repeating with different characters playing familiar roles. The games let you experience that tragedy as interactive horror, fighting through environments designed by people who decided your death was an acceptable cost for their research. The story underneath asks whether fighting is enough, whether prevention counts as victory when threats never fully stop, whether individual courage matters against institutional indifference. The answer isn't hopeful. The answer is that fighting matters because the alternative is accepting atrocity as inevitable, because preventing specific catastrophes saves specific lives even when it doesn't change broader systems, because choosing to resist corrupted authority is meaningful even when resistance doesn't culminate in revolution. Rose stands at her father's grave, 18 years old, about to be recruited into a fight that's been ongoing since before she was born. She carries powers inherited from bioweapon research that killed thousands. She's the daughter of two people who died fighting institutional horror. She's the latest generation in a timeline that stretches back to a grieving mother in a cave who touched fungus that would eventually spawn an industry. And somewhere in laboratories hidden behind corporate fronts and government classifications, researchers are developing the next virus, the next enhancement, the next weapon that will require new heroes to fight containment battles against threats that remain profitable enough to justify continued development. The cycle doesn't break. It just continues, generation after generation, horror after horror, with different faces and the same underlying dynamics that make weaponizing life seem reasonable to people who've concluded that some goals justify any method. That's the real horror Resident Evil offers, not the zombies or bioweapons, but the recognition that systems that create such horrors are resilient, adaptive, and embedded in power structures that protect them. And the heroes who fight those systems do so knowing they're preventing today's catastrophe while tomorrow's is already being planned, that their victories are necessary but not sufficient, that the fight continues because stopping means accepting the unacceptable. Rose gets in the vehicle. The story continues beyond where we can see. And the timeline that began with a mother's grief ends with a daughter's inheritance. The burden of fighting horrors that should never have been created, but now exist permanently in the world, requiring constant vigilance from people willing to stand between institutional evil and the vulnerable populations it treats as experimental material. The lights go out. The timeline ends not with resolution, but with continuation. Another generation picking up the burden, another cycle beginning while previous cycles still haven't concluded. This is the horror we carry forward. Not biological contamination, but systemic corruption. Not viral infection, but institutional rot that normalizes atrocity when profits justify methods. And the real terror is recognizing versions of these dynamics in reality, understanding that fiction exaggerates patterns that exist in less dramatic forms, seeing how power shields itself through complexity and deniability, while consequences fall on people who never consented to becoming casualties in wars they didn't know were happening. That's what Resident Evil's timeline teaches across its 115 years and 30-plus games. Grief becomes a weapon. Science becomes an atrocity. Heroes fight because fighting matters, even when victory looks like preventing catastrophe rather than achieving peace. And cycles continue until someone addresses root causes instead of just treating symptoms.